Basically, of the land, I keep showing you this just because I want it to be something you cannot escape. I want you to think about it as you're going to sleep at night. Chapter 1, we have the inauguration, then we have Jesus' ministry beginning, and as I was saying earlier, we have the authority of his word and the authority of his touch. Those seem to be what Mark is highlighting. This latter part of the discussion we covered last week, Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law by the mere touch, you recall. He reaches out, there's no word spoken, no indication that he said anything. He just takes her by the hand, and that's how Mark now introduces this new theme, as it were, in this chapter. From there we hear that he's healing many others, and you can imagine the crowd gathered around the front door, that courtyard of Mark's home, and he's just working through the crowd, you see, touching, speaking, and there is healing that's going on as Mark describes it to us. But of course, Jesus is not going to be settling down in Capernaum, and as we saw last week, his purpose is to begin a tour in which he'll go through all of the some 200 towns or so of Galilee, Sabbath to Sabbath, synagogue to synagogue, town to town, and he'll be preaching in each one of them. That's the plan, that's the idea, but the whole purpose is interrupted by an encounter with a man who is said to be a leper. And as we're going to see in a sense, this appears, at least for a time, to derail Jesus' purpose, and we'll find at least the implication of that as we go along. So this story, concluding chapter 1, now a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him, saying to him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." I was reading one commentator, and he just brought out a delicious insight into this verse that I thought I'd pass along to you, in which he saw in the actions of the leper in this verse a wonderful paradigm for worship. You'll notice what the leper does. 4 things. First of all, he came. That in itself was a courageous act. He did an illegal act. This was civil disobedience. Lepers were not supposed to get within 50 feet of someone who was not another leper, you see. There were civil sanctions against it. There was also an incredibly strong social taboo. So you know that this man had to think about that for a minute. He's outside of town, and here comes Jesus, whose reputation has preceded him, and he has to think, does he have the guts to walk across that line? Does he have the courage to come within the bubble that's supposed to protect someone like Jesus, breaking social convention? Jesus must have been outside of town because this man could not have been in town, as you know. Did he have that courage? And this commentator was making the point that in a sense that is the state of mind that each of us should have. There's a sense in which when we come into the presence of God, we should be terrified. There's a sense in which there's a holy terror of coming into the presence of the one who is absolutely righteous and perfect. And in the Old Testament, that terror was reinforced rather dramatically. People who just sallied into the presence of God were struck dead, you see. There was an idea that this is a sacred precinct and you don't just come wandering in. But when Jesus was crucified, the veil was rent, the welcome mat was rolled out, and we have been commanded in the New Testament to do the thing which would have seemed unthinkable, terrifying, namely to come boldly. Just as this leper had to kind of gird up the loins and become bold, courageous, even though he was feeling the terror of what he was doing, in a sense, we, seeing ourselves a bit like lepers, unworthy of the presence of Christ, the presence of God, are told to come boldly to the throne of grace that we might make our petitions there. So the leper kind of stands in the first instance for this holy boldness mixed with our sense of unworthiness. He came begging. That is to say, he came with humility. He didn't come with conceit, with arrogance. He didn't come in sort of swaggering. He came with a sense that he deserved nothing. And the question he asks is so remarkable. He says, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Notice the leper has no doubt that Jesus can do it. He knows enough about Jesus and his reputation to know that Jesus is competent, but he has no idea whether Jesus would do it. Is this leper so corrupt, so deeply defiled, so unclean that even Jesus would just say, oh, come on, get away from me, not you. He thought maybe that would happen. What does he know about Jesus, except that he's a healer? And so he's taking this risk of coming into the presence of Christ with a humble petition. I know you can. I don't know if you will, but would you? And that, again, you see, is descriptive, in a sense, of how we come before God. We are unworthy of the least of his favors. We live bathing in his favors constantly. Every breath we take is a gift of his mercy. And yet there is a sense in which we should always be right at the edge, realizing that every gift we received is much more than we deserved. And for us to come in and seek once again some gift, there's a kind of deep humility that we find in this leper that probably every one of us should have something of that going on as well. He knelt. This leper came into the presence of Christ, assuming the posture of worship. There is something to be said for a posture of worship. Some churches have kneeling benches. We don't. Wouldn't mind if we did, but don't you? You've been in places where, as part of the worship experience, you kneel. And there's a connection between body and soul. Somehow when the body is in the right posture, it helps the soul get into the right posture. And so this man came into the presence of Christ, and he knelt, and he probably, in the customary ancient Near Eastern fashion, knelt with his face to the ground. He probably had his nose in the dirt. He comes courageously, humbly, he bows before this one, makes his petition. I don't know if you will, but I know you can. Make me clean. And then he pleads. Leprosy in the ancient world was commonly viewed as a form of God's judgment. The assumption was, if you had leprosy, you had messed up. And therefore, in some sense, you're getting what you deserve. How often do we look at people who are in unhappy circumstances in life, and the thought flashes through our mind, well, they're probably just getting what they deserve. You ever thought that way? Look at that person. Well, I wonder how they messed up to get there. Well, that was commonly assumed about the condition of leprosy. And there was some reason for it. In the Old Testament, you recall leprosy did sometimes represent God's judgment. So, for example, Miriam, the sister of Moses, the sister of Aaron, a rather high prestige person, in the community of Israel, joins in a little rebellion at one point against Moses, and she's struck with leprosy. Moses himself is aghast. He goes into the presence of God, pleading for his sister Miriam, that God would remove this from her. Punishment for her rebellion. And God says, hey, she's going to spend some time outside the camp. She's going to spend some time in her condition of uncleanness, in the place of uncleanness, to drive home the point that you don't rebel against the authority that I have invested in your society here in Moses. Well, Moses' prayer prevails, but she still has leprosy for a week before she's brought back in the camp. Even more dramatic, you recall the story of Uzziah, the king. Wonderful, brilliant, successful. There's virtually a whole chapter that celebrates all of his achievements, his genius, his wonderful faithfulness to God. And then at one point, he's carried away, swept away, kind of in his own sense of conceit at all the things that he's accomplished, and he decides he's going to become messianic. And he's going to marry the office of the priest with the office of the king. He's going to presume to do what only the priest was permitted to do, and he grabs some incense and heads into the temple to do what all of the pagan rulers of the ancient world did and try to come off as this one consolidated idea of religious and political authority. There's a reason in America we've had this notion of a division, a separation of church and state, because we know that if you unite all authority in one person, you got a problem. And in the ancient Near East, the rulers of Assyria, the rulers of Egypt, the rulers of the Hittites, they all did that. They all came off as demigods because they put all that authority together. And Uzziah said, that looks like fun. I think I'd like to be the priest king, the messianic character. And he goes into the temple. Courageous priests stand in his way. Wait a minute, Uzziah, what are you doing? This is not for you. Go do your politics. Uzziah will not be deterred, and what happens? Struck with leprosy. In his case, it didn't go away. And he spent the rest of his life in isolation. The king of Judah, in isolation. His son had to do the day-to-day ruling of the country because he was unclean to the day of his death. And so the Jewish people had that kind of precedent in their own history that if you have leprosy, it probably represents God's judgment. And really, many people who were lepers saw it that way. I can imagine this guy wondered, what did I do? Well, what was my infraction? There must have been some awful thing I did. I can't even think what it was. Or maybe he could think what it was. I don't know. But one way or another, there was a common view taken for granted that if you had leprosy, you were under God's judgment. And for that reason, he comes begging, he comes pleading. He doesn't come in with that kind of common objection you hear, why me? Why did this happen to me? What did I, it's nothing of that. He comes in probably believing that somehow he deserved it. But he comes nevertheless with this kind of intensity, this appeal that in spite of his wrongdoing, whatever it might be, that God would give him mercy. Martin Luther famously said that our prayers should be brief, intense, and frequent. Dale Bruner once spoke at a conference on that, and he picked up at that point the nickname Biff. Biff Bruner. Did you ever hear that, Brief, intense, and frequent. This leper embraced that pretty well. His prayer was brief. This wasn't a long, eloquent speech. It was intense for sure. I don't know how frequent it was. I think just one time, but there it was. And he came in asking. Notice that of all the diseases we know of in the Bible, all of them are healed with one exception. Leprosy is never healed, it's cleansed. It's a condition of uncleanness. And this man had a sense of his uncleanness. So he doesn't come to Jesus saying, please heal me. He says, please cleanse me. And so this prayer really does, in many ways, I think, reflects something of what the attitude of worship should be. That we come pleading, kneeling, begging, and yet boldly. And it's a good picture for us. Well, the man is there. His nose is in the dirt. I don't know how much time there is between verse 41 and verse 42. Did Jesus leave him there for a moment to think about it? Was there a little pause? Was there this dramatic? I don't know. But notice, Mark says, then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I am willing. Be cleansed. The word there, moved with compassion. My little byline title for this course is in Mark, Jesus, the man of action and compassion. Both of those really describe Jesus in Mark's gospel. He's not a very talkative Jesus, as Mark portrays him, but he's always on the move. He's touching people, he's doing things, he's in action, and the dominant emotion that we hear again and again is he is a man of compassion. And so this is your Greek lesson for the day. Isn't that a fun-looking word? Splachnistes. Splachnistes, to be moved with compassion. It comes from the word for bowels. You who are old enough to have grown up in the original King James Version, as I did, remember that strange expression, bowels of compassion. Remember that? I know as a kid I always thought about that. What is that? Because that's it. From the point of view of the ancient, your deepest emotion came right out of your guts. And it was a word that actually you can't even say it unless you sort of force it up from your guts. Splachnistai. That doesn't just trip off the tongue. This is not French. This is German. This is a strong word. This is Greek. And it represents the word itself kind of gives you the flavor of it. And how many times in Mark's gospel is Jesus said to be moved with compassion? There's a strong correlation between the emotion of compassion and the physical experience of tears. We don't hear of Jesus weeping often, but at least implicitly, he may have often been moved to tears because that word compassion implies it. And this man comes to him now, terrified, not sure, anxious, bold, but humble, pleading, intense, face on the ground, and Jesus is moved with compassion. Doesn't say a word, reaches out and touches him. What kind of drama is there? The man doesn't know what's going to happen. He thinks he might look back up and see Jesus, 100 yards down the road. Instead, he feels his hand on his head, probably, and he looks up. And he looks into the eyes of one who has tears coming down his face, maybe. And Jesus says to him, I'm willing. I'm willing. Be cleansed. It's a powerful moment. It really is supposed to say something to us of the heart of the character of Christ, that he reaches out and touches this one who was, by definition in the ancient world, untouchable. I just throw in passing, there's some textual evidence that the word for compassion here is actually the word for anger. Now, I don't want to get into the technical side of this, and neither do you, but sometimes texts will have a little variance in them, and it is possible that it could be this word. It's not a strong evidence, but at least some. Jesus also in Mark's gospel is said to be angry on multiple occasions. Just as Mark has more to say about the touch of Jesus than the other gospel writers, in some ways he has a lot to say about the anger of Jesus that exceeds what you'd find in other gospel writers. He's a more passionate man in many respects. If it is anger, then it would certainly be anger on the part of Jesus at the fact that he's in a world that has been touched so broadly by the unclean one, so much so that we have uncleanness, such as is reflected here. I'll leave that to your own musing. But these words, I don't suppose the leper had ever heard sweeter. I am willing. Not I am able, which he certainly was, but the heart here, I am willing. Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. The leper violated a social taboo to come into the presence of Jesus. Jesus violated a weightier social taboo by reaching out and touching the man. This was actually more shocking to the people who were there observing this than that the leper came into Jesus' presence in the first place. He touched the man. In Mark's gospel especially, he does this in the majority of healings. And part of the point of all of this is to say that Jesus is not, of course, defiled by touching the one who is unclean. It runs in the opposite direction. He removes defilement by his touch. Everywhere he goes, things become clean. And this leper, in a sense, stands for that proposition. Jesus cleanses, therefore, in Mark's view, by the authority of his word and his touch. There is something microcosmic here. Just as there was when Jesus exorcised the demon back in the synagogue. You recall, if you were here that Sunday, we said that the demon-possessed man was said to be in the evil or wicked or unclean spirit in the spirit. Not the spirit was in him, he was in it, as if to say, in its grasp. And when Jesus said, "Be quiet and come out of the man," in a sense what he did for that demon-possessed man emblemized what he was doing for the whole world. He came to destroy the authority, the works of the devil. He came to undo that diabolical control of this world that had dominated human history up until his moment. Now, in a sense, the same thing is happening. This leper, kind of like a microcosm of the whole world, the effect of that uncleanness. And he says, "Be clean." And in a sense, that moment stands for the broad effect that Jesus had in all of human history, because, as you know, from this point on, from the moment of the life and impact of Christ on, the Christian movement has seen, and it's generally affected, influenced the rest of human history, that there are no unclean people. You see, in the Christian view, there are no people who are inherently inferior or unclean or untouchable, second-class citizens. Now, we've never quite lived up to the rule. We've had our fits and starts on this. But the fact of the matter is, the best of Christian history has stood stalwartly for the idea that every human being has dignity, every human being is created in the image of God, and whether they do well or not so well, they deserve the kind of respect that comes by virtue of that status. Thomas Jefferson famously wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Well, when he said that in 1776, there were a whole lot of people that would have been pretty shocked to hear such a thing. Some people say, well, Jefferson got it from the Enlightenment. Don't you believe it? He got it from the Reformers. Way before the Enlightenment came along, Johnny-come-lately. It was the Reformers, and especially, well, Calvin and Luther both, who emphatically drove home the point that while we make artificial distinctions in human society between nobility and commoner, before God, everybody is in the same deep need of grace. And nobody is any better inherently, intrinsically than anybody else. That principle of fundamental equality before God is a biblical idea. And nobody really ever heard of it until Jesus came along and in effect said through his message and through his ministry and through the effect of the gospel, there is no Jew or Greek, there is no bond nor free, there is no slave, there is no male or female, and so on. You see, it was a different view. We Christians don't observe kosher. We don't believe that there are unclean foods anymore. Mark has quite a discussion of that in chapter 7. When Jesus says to the religious leaders that were challenging him, it's not what goes in the mouth that defiles a man, it's what comes out of the mouth. And Jesus removes this idea that there is in this world some foods that are just intrinsically unclean. The uncleanness is a moral uncleanness in our heart, not a kind of ceremonial, static uncleanness of people or foods or places. In the ancient world, in the old covenant regime, if you wanted to go to the place of holiness, you had to move geographically. You had to go on a pilgrimage to a holy place. The most of the world was unclean, but there was a holy place that was clean. And you had to pilgrimage there. The Christian movement has no notion of pilgrimage. I know we've had Christians that practice pilgrimage, but it's not a biblical idea, because Christ made the world clean. And then he said to his apostles that this movement that he started is not going to wait around for the world to come to them. They go to the world. You go to the world and preach the gospel in every dark corner of it, because all of this world is mine. All authority has been given unto me, and there is no off-limits place anymore. There's no unclean place. There's no place to be avoided. No unclean people, no unclean foods, no unclean places. The world is the Lord's, and His is, and our task is to take this to that world, you see. And this is all the effect of Jesus. We're still figuring it out. We haven't quite caught up with His genius yet. But when he touched a leper and sent uncleanness away, in a sense, it emblemized touching the world and doing something of the same thing in human history. As soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. And he strictly warned him and sent him away at once and said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone. First thing we notice is that the leprosy left him immediately. This is Mark's favorite word, of course, euthus, immediately, uses it a lot. But there is a little bit of theology hiding in this. Christ made the man clean immediately. There was no process of cleaning up. There was no kind of regime, a sort of procedure that he had to go through. It was an instantaneous effect. One of the principles that drove the Protestant Reformation was an objection to the idea that we are made clean in a kind of progressive way. And the Catholic teaching to this day, actually, is the notion of congruous merit, a sort of mixture in which you're always kind of a mixture of the good and the bad, and you're never quite sure if you're clean enough to be called justified. And so there is a sort of gray area. Some of you grew up Catholic, you know what Catholic guilt means. You know that idea. You're never quite sure. You don't know. Do you need to go to Mass a couple of more times? Do you need to do this, do that? I'm not trying to disparage Catholics, but I'm just saying the Protestants objected to that. Calvin, Luther objected, and they introduced the notion that justification is what they call forensic justification. What they meant by that was, you are just, you are clean before God because God says so, not because you cleaned yourself up. Before you clean yourself up, God simply pronounces you clean, and you'll never be cleaner than when God says you're clean. The Reformers said you're justified by faith alone. It was what they're always saying, you're justified by Christ alone. Your cleanliness is 100% the work of His blood, not the work of your labors, you see. There is a momentary, instantaneous declaration, you are clean. Now there's room for sanctification, friends. So even though we're clean, there's growth, there's diligence, there's discipline, there's growing in grace, there's learning to rely on Him more, there's learning to trust Him more. We still are very imperfect, but that doesn't alter the fact that we are clean by the blood of Christ, not by the weightiness of our virtue. When this man was pronounced clean, he was clean, just like that. Just as we are pronounced clean, and in an instant, it takes place. We're surprised here at how Jesus speaks to the man. It's a very strong Greek expression here, so strong that it's usually not translated as sort of viciously as it is. It actually means he warned him with severity. The picture you have, I don't think that quite happened this way, but it could have happened such that, Jesus took the man by the collar, yanked him up, got in his face, now look here, bud, don't tell anybody about this. It's like, you be quiet. There's a strong kind of emphatic character to the way in which Mark says this. It's interesting, of course, you read the story of Jesus and you see that many times he commands to silence. It gave rise to as we said last week, the notion of the messianic secret, which I mentioned briefly. Sometimes Jesus commands silence, sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he commands people to speak. The case of the Gadarene demoniac, you remember? Wanted to follow Jesus back to Galilee. Jesus says, no, you stay here. You go and speak. You go tell people the good things that God has done for you. So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing, but it does seem that when Jesus is concerned about his immediate plan, he wants to go from village to village. He doesn't want huge crowds sort of impeding the way, and he knows that if this guy goes out and becomes his cheerleader, it's probably going to be more harm than good. And so he severely warns him, don't you tell anybody about this, Well, instead he tells him to go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing those things which Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Jesus tells the man who is now clean, based on Jesus' word, to go and present himself to the priest, because in the ancient Jewish view there was form and matter. Aristotle made that distinction, but it's sort of a common sense distinction. There is that which is true formally and that which is true substantially or materially. The man was materially clean. He was clean, substantially clean at that moment, perfectly clean, but it still required a formal attestation. It was the priest who had the authority to make him officially clean, you see. So he had to go to the priest, and he had to go through the regime that was incumbent upon a person to become officially clean. It's sort of like we in our Presbyterian tradition. We baptize infants, of course, but if someone comes and they've come to faith as an adult, then we want to make sure they have faith before we baptize them. We say, well, do you trust in Christ as your Savior? Have you surrendered your life to Him? Are you in fact a Christian in your heart, substantially, materially? And if so, then in baptism we're going to make you officially a Christian, visibly a Christian, formally a Christian, because you're already materially one, you see. So that distinction is at work, and Jesus is playing by the rules. This man is clean from leprosy, but he still needs to go through the formal process. And so he sends him to the priest to do those things that Moses commanded, which was a fairly elaborate process. There was several days involved. There were multiple offerings that were given. It took, some time to do it. And Jesus interestingly says, do this as a testimony to them. What should have happened here, the priest had a kind of official duty to be the truth serum, as it were. He's going to determine whether or not this leper is clean. And if he finds that he's clean, he's going to pronounce him clean. But he's also supposed to recognize that this Jesus of Nazareth, being the one responsible for the man's cleanliness, has therefore the credentials of an attested prophet of God. Jesus was more than that, but not less than that. And so the priest should have also, in a sense, officially sanctioned at this moment Jesus. Based on the evidence of his ability to perform this miracle, the priest should have said, it appears to me that this man is an attested messenger from God. We should listen to him. Oddly enough, ironically, of course, what happened in the priestly class was not an inclination toward Jesus, but a rising hostility against him. But nevertheless, Jesus once again sends the man to the priests so that they will have the opportunity to do what they're supposed to do as a testimony to them. Well, the man, however, goes a different track, you know. However, he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the matter so that Jesus could no longer openly enter the city, but was outside in deserted places, and they came to him from every direction. One commentator called this exuberant disobedience. You ever been there? So excited that you just can't contain yourself. I imagine that was probably what was going on. Emotion without discipline. Excited but self-centered. He put himself and his interests, his enthusiasm, which you can certainly admire from afar, you can appreciate the joy that he probably felt, but he put all of that ahead of Jesus' express and rather severe command, that he should do something different. The net result, he did more harm than good. And so Jesus, who was making his tour through Galilee, all of a sudden is put in a tough position, because now he can't enter villages anymore. You've got this rising crowd, and from Mark's point of view, the crowd is always a mixed blessing. They tend to be problematic, and this is just one of many cases where we're going to see that. So Jesus has to make adjustments. Jim Edwards commented on this. There's a bit of an irony to it, because up until this moment, Jesus was free to enter the towns, but the leper had to stay out of town. After it, the leper could go into town, but Jesus had to stay out of town. He made Jesus the outsider, you see. And all of a sudden now, Jesus is forced into this position of having to stay away from the towns just because of the impediment represented by all of these. Well, what to do? Apparently, that incident and that man and his sort of disruptive impact sent Jesus back to Capernaum. And so verse 1 of chapter 2 says, he again entered Capernaum after some days, and it was heard that he was in the house. I'm not going to proceed into chapter 2, but I do, as part of my Sunday school lesson this morning, to give you a real quick, just kind of a one-liner on each of the next 5 stories. As we were saying, the authority of Christ is really rolled out for us by Mark in chapter 1, the authority of word and deed, and the authority especially to cleanse things. Now we find kind of the other side in the next 5 stories, and that is that this authority of Jesus, which is an inherent charismatic authority, meaning it's simply an authority that issues forth from his own character, his own person, comes up against the bureaucratic authority of the religious leadership there in Israel, which by this time had become, for the most part, corrupted. And so it's a conflict of 2 authorities, the authority of Christ and an escalating drama of the authority of those who are beginning to resist him. And 5 stories highlight that for us, but I think they also give us 5 little lessons that I want to mention. So we'll cover these in detail starting next week, but just kind of a quick sketch of where it goes from here. The first of the stories, healing the paralytic. This is the guys that climbed up on the roof and dug through, and let the guy down on a mat. And Jesus looks at the man and says to him, "Son, cheer up, your sins are forgiven." And there are religious authorities there, and they are a little bit upset. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Who does this guy think he is? To which Jesus responds, "But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, arise, take up your bed, go to your house." Irrefutable proof that the word of Jesus, speaking to the forgiveness of this man, was in fact sanctioned by God in the event of healing him. Well, the first little Sunday school lesson for us this morning is that we live in the context of forgiveness. Jesus tells us that we should forgive as we have been forgiven, that if a person doesn't forgive the one that's offended against him, neither will your Father forgive you, because manifestly you're possessed of an unforgiving spirit. And the very evidence of grace in your life will be forgiveness. But you know something? It's easy for us to forget that. I don't know about you, but I'm amazed at how often I've been made to feel guilty by folks, and I think I may have done it myself a few times. You ever done that? There's great power in making folks feel guilty. If you can make someone feel guilty, you can put them in a very desperately dependent circumstance. In a sense, the Pharisees had a corner on the market, because this protest of theirs, who can forgive sins but God alone, is in a sense saying, wait a minute, we're the brokers of forgiveness in this place. We're the ones who have the power to deal that kind of commodity. What does this man think he's doing? If Jesus can just unilaterally forgive sins, then they've just lost an awful lot of status in the community, because they're the ones who have been kind of the dispensers, you see, of forgiveness and announcements of forgiveness and so on. And so the first lesson here is that we are God's people and are called to be rich in mercy. Father, forgive them, forgive them, forgive them, even when we're offended. The second story, the Call of Levi. Jesus calls Levi. He was probably a kind of a major character in a customs office there in Capernaum. Levi follows him, drops everything, gives himself a going-away party. He calls all his friends over to his house. They have a big celebration. Jesus is there. His disciples are there. The people who are gathered in this place are called publicans and tax collectors. And again, the religious leaders are a little bit upset at that, you see. What is this? Jesus overhears the conversation. Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. The lesson for us here is, let's be very careful anytime we start looking at others and thinking, boy, I sure am glad I'm not like that. There was a Pharisee in the temple who looked at a miserable tax collector, and he prayed a prayer of thanksgiving. Father, I thank you that I'm not like that man. I thank you that I am so much better. I thank you that I'm a righteous man. I fast multiple times a day. I pay my tithe. I do this. I do that. I thank you, praise you that I'm not like that miserable creature over there. And Jesus says, which one went away justified? It is so easy to look at human beings and forget, there but for the grace of God go I. And the Pharisees kind of forgot that, but it's something we need to always remember. The third lesson, fasting. This was a conflict over the rules of religious discipline. And Jesus said, no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine bursts the wineskins, the wine is spilled, the wineskins are ruined, but new wine must go into new wineskins. Many of us in this room, I want to put this politely, but we're getting up there. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm in the head of the line. I know something about getting older. I never thought it would happen to me. But you know what? I love my routine. I love to do the same thing every day. And I don't like it when my routine gets upset, even a little bit. I get a little bit anxious. Are you like that? You know? And we always have to ask the question, am I becoming a pretty old wineskin so that there's no room for any new wine in my life? What if Jesus wants to put some new wine into my wineskin? What's going to happen? Is it just going to cause me to explode? You know? I'll never forget, the greatest lesson I learned in this was way back when I was at Whitworth University, and my beloved professor, Dr. Norman Krebs, who had been a lifelong Presbyterian pastor, retired from the pastorate, went back to school, got his PhD, and was a professor. And he was one of the major influences in my life back in those years. He's now with the Lord, of course. But when the Jesus movement took place in downtown Spokane, a lot of folks, and I hate to say it, a lot of Presbyterians were a little put off by those guys, those strange Jesus freaks, you know. Norm Krebs, he was fascinated. He would go down and just, you know, he didn't try to become one. He didn't grow his hair out. He didn't, you know, he knew this wasn't his life, but he was so fascinated that God was doing something so unexpected. New wine, and he didn't want to miss it. And I learned something about new wine and new wineskins from him as he, you know, a man already in his 60s at that time, was still there, just absorbing the atmosphere and rejoicing in it. And we need to ask ourselves, you know, how flexible are we when God wants to do something new, something different in our lives? The next story, labor and the Sabbath. Jesus claims remarkably, powerfully, really dramatically, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath had become a principle of bondage. The Sabbath was all about the things you can't do. Jesus flipped that on its head and made the Sabbath about something of liberty, not bondage. Something that frees us, not ties us up. And this was such a different way of thinking about the Sabbath. And then it's complemented by the last of these when he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to lose or to kill? He's saying that to people who are plotting his destruction on the Sabbath, you see. And he's plotting to heal a man with a withered hand. And he establishes the principle that has gone with the Christian movement since, that the Sabbath is not fundamentally a day of rest, it is a day of action. The Sabbath is an action day. But it's not the normal action of day-to-day, go to work, earn a living, you know, that kind of thing. This is a day in which we liberate ourselves to actions of Christian service, acts of charity. The Westminster Confession famously celebrates that the Sabbath should be one of the most active days of the week because we are out serving. The ancient world said, oh, you're walking too far, you're carrying too much, you're doing too much, you need to slow down, you need to stop, you see, not Christ. That's the great paradigm shift that he brings to the picture. He liberates Christian people to be purely Christian in their service on the Sabbath. So what are the 5 principles? Number 1, forgiveness. Be forgiven, live in forgiveness. 2, equality. Nobody is beneath your dignity. 3, new wine. Be flexible, wait for God's Spirit to move in your heart and be ready to move with Him. Travel light, sit loose in the saddle, watching for how God may be working in your life. 4th, see God's effect in your life through Christ as liberation. We are not, as Christians, primarily concerned about what we can't do. We're thinking mostly about what we can do and should do and will do by His grace. And that word is sort of wrapped up in the 5th of these, that we are to live lives of servant. Let him who wants to be greatest of all among you be servant of all, which becomes part of course, the defining quality of the Christian movement. So.